Part 2 of Gagnes Conditions of Learning. Nine phases of learning. According to Robert Gagnes, there are 9 events that activate processes needed for effective learning. Gagnes believed all lessons should include this sequence of events. He believed that basic concepts must be understood first before moving to a higher level. The theory outlines the 9 instructional events and corresponding cognitive processes. The nature of complex learning. Gagnes' analysis of learning includes 2 organizations of capabilities that represent complex learning. The 2 organizations are procedures and learning hierarchies. A procedure is a set of different actions that must be executed in a sequential or step-like fashion, and an organization of skills that includes both motor and intellectual skills. An example is writing a check or balancing a checkbook. Conditional procedures require decisions about alternative steps at certain points in the procedure. In this situation, the outcomes of one step provides clues to the choice to be made in the next step. An example would be balancing a checkbook. The individual first must determine if the checks are in numerical order. If not, the next step is to arrange the checks in sequence by date. Learning hierarchy. Gagnes proposed a system of classifying different types of learning in terms of the degree of complexity of the mental processes involved. He identified 8 basic types and arranged these in the hierarchy shown in the figure. According to Gagnes, the higher orders of learning in this hierarchy build upon the lower levels, requiring progressively greater amounts of previous learning for their success. The lowest 4 orders tend to focus on the more behavioral aspects of learning, while the highest 4 focus on the more cognitive aspects. Principles of instruction. The underlying assumption derived from Gagnes' ideas about learning and instruction is that learning is complex and diverse. Different learning outcomes requires different instructions, prerequisites, and processing by the learners. In other words, the specific operations that constitute instructional events are different for each different type of learning outcome. Events of learning operate on the learner in ways that constitute the conditions of learning. The internal states required in the learner to acquire the new skills are internal conditions of learning, and the environmental stimuli required to support the internal learning process are external conditions of learning. Instruction should provide a set of component tasks and sequence those tasks to ensure the learner's mastery of each component task and the optimal transfer of the final task. Basic assumptions. Learning can occur whether or not instruction is present. When deliberately planned to support learning, they are instructional events. These external events do not produce learning. Instead, they can only support the learner's internal processing. A second characteristic of instruction is that it does not have a single unitary purpose. Instead, instruction fulfills several functions that match the different information processing of learning. Third, decisions about instruction must be made in the context of the skill or skills to be learned. Instruction for information, for example, is not the same as instruction for motor skills. The nature of instruction design. The focus in Gagnes' principles is on instruction rather than simply teaching. The intent is to address all the events that may directly influence an individual's learning. Components of instruction. The 5 assumptions support Gagnes' recommendations for designing instruction. First is that instruction should be designed for the individual student because learning takes place within the individual. The other 4 assumptions establish the foundation for the systematic design of instruction. They are to situate daily planning for instruction within long-range planning. Suggested verbs for the varieties of learning. These suggested verbs for learning are similar in design to Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive learning outcomes in that they both recognize the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains and specified conditions under which the outcomes could best be met. Gagnes developed the following conditions of learning with standard verbs to correspond to the learning outcomes. Verbal information would include verbs such as state, define, recite, tell, declare. Motor skills would include verbs such as execute, perform, and carry out. Attitude would include verbs such as choose, prefer, elect, favor. Cognitive strategy would include adopt, create, and originate. The intellectual skills include discrimination. Discrimination would include verbs such as discriminate, distinguish, differentiate. The concrete concept would include verbs such as identify, name, specify, label. The role would include verbs such as demonstrate, show, solve. And the higher order role would include generate, develop, solve. These are all suggested verbs for the varieties of learning. Relationships between learning phases and the instructional events. The 3 phases of the 9 phases of learning are described as follows. Preparing for learning is to gain attention, inform objectives, and stimulate recall of prior knowledge are 3 instructional events that set the stage for new learning. Acquisition and performance are the core events of instruction and are presenting stimulus material, provide learner guidance, elicit performance, and provide feedback. Transfer of learning is the final phase of instruction, and it provides for assessment performance of new learning and enhances retention and the transfer processes. The unique external conditions of learning for the 5 varieties. Gagnes identifies 5 major categories of learning: verbal information, intellectual skills, cognitive strategies, motor skills, and attitudes. The different internal and external conditions are necessary for each type of learning. Major steps in cognitive task analysis. Cognitive task analysis is an extension of traditional task analysis emerged to address the goals, knowledge, mental processes, and decisions that underlie observable actions. The first 3 steps in cognitive task analysis are to collect preliminary information about the task, identify essential subtasks, and use interviews to identify the needed conditions and cognitive processes essential for the tasks. Then the instructional designer categorized and summarized the data and presents results. The final step is to format the results for use. The content task analysis is used to analyze job components in various situations.